second. Joining me now to talk through the stories in a bit more detail is Albie Amankona, political commentator and the co-founder of Conservatives Against Racism. Albie, good morning.
Good morning, Rosie.
It's been an extraordinary weekend of sporting coverage because it looked very different to how it did before. We had programmes going on without live commentary. Match of the Day, bizarrely, I'm sure because of the public intrigue, got more viewers than it has done in a very long time, as we all, with mass intrigue, tuned in to see what was going on. What do you think is going to happen?
You're absolutely right to say it's been an absolutely extraordinary weekend for the BBC and especially their sporting output. You know, we saw Match of the Day 2 last night reduced to just 15 minutes long because they didn't have any pundits. Saturday's Match of the Day, as you mentioned just earlier on, had an extra, I think, 0.5 million extra viewers, despite the fact that Gary Lineker, Ian Wright, Alan Shearer, Alex Scott and other pundits stood down. Maybe people were watching it out of curiosity. I have to say, it still didn't make me watch it. But ultimately, the question is, what happens next? What comes next? Will Gary Lineker go back to his position at the BBC? I think the mood music is probably suggesting that we will see a return of Lineker ahead of next weekend's football fixtures. You've been hearing a lot of people making the comparison between Gary Lineker making partisan points on social media and other BBC entertainment figures like Lord Alan Sugar making similar remarks, and he's never faced the rebuke that Gary Lineker is, and he's actually been quite supportive of the Conservative Party recently. So I'm expecting there to be some sort of fudge so that Gary Lineker, along with all of his other pundits who have been standing in solidarity with him, can return to our screens ahead of next weekend.
Yeah. Really difficult position that many other members of staff were put in. Sort of there was a bit of a gap that opened up between BBC Sport Radio and then the TV staff, because BBC Radio 5 commentators were suddenly really torn to say, well, what do we do? Do we sort of join our on-screen counterparts and walkouts, or do we come back and take part right up until kick-off? It must have been really uncomfortable for many people working over the weekend. At the heart of this is a debate about how important the BBC's impartiality is. Do you think they've got the balance right?
Look, one of the things that makes the BBC such a respected institution in this country and around the world is because of its ability to deliver impartial news. Now, the argument that a lot of people are making is that when it comes to entertainment output or sports output, does it matter if those members of staff are as impartial as someone like Hugh Edwards or someone like Laura Kuenssberg, for example? And that's really where the whole argument is at the moment. And I think it is actually probably reasonable for the BBC staff who aren't doing news output to have a little bit more of an opinion. No one complained when it was Lord Sugar. Why are people complaining when it's Gary Lineker?
Rishi Sunak is saying, look, this row distracts from the story at the heart of this that started it, the migrant crisis.
Precisely, and it's almost actually quite a convenient story for the government, because instead of talking about the illegal migration bill, which the government introduced to the House of Commons last week, we're actually talking about this punch-up between the BBC and Gary Lineker and 36 Tory MPs who have written to the Prime Minister to try and get Gary Lineker sacked, without actually scrutinising the policy which was announced last week, which we don't even know whether or not it's going to actually pass legal tests. We don't know if it's actually legal what the government is proposing. We don't know if it's actually going to stop the boats. It's not that different from the Nationality and Borders Bill brought in by the last Home Secretary, Priti Patel. That didn't stop the boats. So it's actually a very convenient argument for the government to be having with the BBC at this time, because we're not actually focusing on the nitty-gritty of a policy which we don't know whether or not will work. We're focusing on a story that's captured everyone's imagination, rather than actually looking at what's actually quite a boring piece of legislation, which we don't know whether or not, as I've mentioned before, if it's going to work.
Yeah, and what's going to cause the controversy is that instead of being able to watch or listen to fighting talk or watch Final Score. You were watching the repair shop instead. We will see how that develops over the day. It looks like negotiations are well and truly underway. Tim Davies flown over from the US to meet face-to-face with Gary Lineker, so we watch and wait. We've mentioned the Prime Minister. On the front page of the Telegraph, and it's inside the Times as well, is this story that Sunak is giving the military a £5 billion boost to face down Russia. He says this is going to fortify our national defences. That will help face down the threat from Russia and China. It seems that the perception on the world stage is that we've got a little bit of work to do to be taken seriously when it comes to defence.
We do have work to do to be taken seriously when it comes to defence. I'm afraid this £5 billion boost, despite it sounding like a large sum of money, I don't think is going to make us be taken seriously on the global stage when it comes to defence. For two reasons. The $3 billion of the money is being committed to the AUKUS deal, which, of course, was announced, I think, almost 2 years ago now. So I'm not sure if that's new money or just money which has been re-announced. And the AUKUS deal is, of course, the deal between Australia, the United Kingdom and the US on nuclear submarines, I think, to combat Chinese aggression in the Asia-Pacific region. And £1.9 billion, so basically £2 billion, is being spent on munitions stockpiles, essentially to replenish what's being given to Ukraine. So this doesn't actually sound like anything new from what has either already been announced in the AUKUS deal almost 2 years ago now, or replenishing supplies which have been used in a war which we didn't plan for in Ukraine. So if we go back 2 years, nothing new has been announced from what was planned 2 years ago, which I actually think is quite concerning. And we're hearing criticism coming from people like General Lord Dannatt and Tobias Ellwood, who are criticising the government for not actually investing in land warfare. And of course, this 2.5% of GDP pledged to be spent on defence in the long term is less than the 3% which was pledged by Liz Truss last summer.
Rishi Sunak's in the States today. We'll have coverage of that meeting that he has, not only with President Biden, but with the Australian Prime Minister as well. Suella Braverman has been writing in the Times. It's page 9 if you've got a copy of the paper today, if you're getting one. Ordering the police today to stop recording the names of those accused of non-crime hate incidents. What's she talking about?
So Suella Braverman is talking about basically incidents where the police will report what is called a non-crime hate incident. So it's basically a hate crime, but it's not actually a crime. So she singles out a specific case of recently an autistic pupil was reported for one of these non-crime hate incidents. His name was added to police files for accidentally or intentionally scuffing a copy of the Quran at Kettlethorpe High School in West Yorkshire, and this caused a huge furore afterwards. It caused a huge public reaction, and people were very unhappy about it. And so this new code of practice is being brought in by Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary. Now, I think it's important to note that non-crime hate incident reporting can have some utility in capturing patterns in individual behaviour and identifying local incident hotspots. And the new code of practice doesn't actually stop non-crime hate incidents from being reported on completely. So you'll hear a lot of free speech advocates saying, oh no, we shouldn't have non-crime hate incidents reported on at all. This isn't actually stopping the NCHIs from being reported. They will actually still be reported on only if it's motivated by an intentional hostility and where there's a real risk of significant harm to a group or an individual. So it sounds like a bit of a fudge here. I don't think free speech advocates are going to be completely comfortable with this. And equally, I don't necessarily think people who want this legislation to stay in place will be particularly happy with this either. So it's a bit of a fudge here.
Writing, she says, people are perfectly entitled to say things about politics, gender and religion that others find offensive. Disagreement is not incitement and nor is irreverence or mockery. It is tricky to get the balance right, isn't it?
It's very tricky to get the balance right, but I think this whole argument that we need to protect free speech and we need to stop recording non-crime hated incidents is a perfectly reasonable argument to have. But if you're going to make that argument, scrap NCHIs altogether. Don't add these caveats into the new code of practice because they've not actually been scrapped. So it's almost this entire article, in my opinion, is almost completely pointless.
We've been talking about the junior doctors going on strike today at 7 o'clock. Well, a story in the Times, this is on page 8, it says the BMA, that's the largest union, it's about 45% of junior doctors that are part of this union, have been accused of blocking strike cover. Ministers believe that the BMA has been deliberately obstructing hospitals' attempts to plan emergency cover during the 3-day strike action. How much public support do you think, Albie, that the junior doctors have?
So I have to declare a personal interest here. So I actually was recently in hospital for 2.5 weeks, and I saw firsthand just how difficult it is for, not just junior doctors, but consultants and nurses working in the NHS at the moment. And junior doctors in particular really are, the backbone, along with nurses, of the NHS. They're a lot of the people going around and doing the morning rounds when they're coming to see patients. They're a lot of the people working overnights in A&E and maternity care and helping with cancer patients. And they haven't had a proper pay rise, they argue, since 2008, and they're demanding a pay rise of 35%, which is quite steep. Now, Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, says this will cost about £2 billion and is simply unaffordable. And they're hoping that pay talks can resume today to try and basically curtail this 72-hour walkout. Ultimately,
so it sounds like you think they should get some sort of a pay rise, but not to the degree of 35%.
I do think they should get some sort of pay rise, but not to the degree of 35%. You're absolutely right there. If we're thinking about junior doctors in particular, these are some of the most well-educated, highly qualified people in the country. They can go and work abroad and get paid a much higher wage. I've got a friend who used to be a junior doctor who's recently gone into venture capital. These people can go and work in other jobs and earn a lot more money than they're currently earning in the NHS, either by working in another career or by moving abroad. So I think it's probably wise to really listen quite carefully to what the junior doctors are saying. However, 35% is a very large sum of money to be paying, £2 billion in the middle of a cost of living crisis. And of course, there are estimates that inflation will drop back down to 2% towards the end of the year. So this is a feature of inflation, and the government's got to balance the inflationary effect on wages and the cost of living with how much these doctors want to be paid.
And how to protect the NHS as well. Well, the BMA spokesman said the union had given the government and the NHS notice of the type of action they were going to take over 2 months and the precise dates for more than 2 weeks. We'll be following this story closely. Albie, it's brilliant that you're out of hospital, back in action, able to talk to us. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Rosie. Take care.